Hey guys, welcome back to Grade 11 Biology series. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the kingdom Protist. So without further ado, let's get started. As you may or may not know that, Protist is the broadest kingdom. They are a diverse group of eukaryotic microorganisms that do not fit into the categories of plants, animals, or fungi. And actually, all eukaryotes that are not animals, plants, or fungi are classified as protists. So protist is a very broad term, and that is why I didn't want to spoil anything about protists in the last episode, because there are literally too many things that we can talk about protists. And scientists are still working on classifying protists into more refined groups or categories, but they haven't gathered enough evidence to establish clear-cut kingdoms yet. But the thing is, for the current classification, kingdom protist is sufficient for scientists to examine their characteristics, behaviors, and the ecological roles in our environment without needing a perfect classification system. But as technology advances, especially in genetics, which I'm going to teach within a month, hopefully, we may see more precise divisions of protists in the future. So some examples of protists include algae and paramecium. So the green yellowish layer on the river or the sea is a type of algae, and this is called paramecium. So don't worry about them because we're gonna come back to them later in the presentation. Protists have the typical eukaryotic cell structure, and they have membrane-bound organelles such as nucleus and mitochondria, and for some species they have chloroplast. And since protist is such a broad term, scientists introduced three subcategories for protists, which are animal-like protists, plant-like protists, as well as fungus-like protists, based on the characteristic of the protist. And we're going to be exploring each of these in today's lesson. So let's start with animal-like protists. Animal-like protists are heterotroph that capture and ingest food. This diagram here shows how paramecium digest food. So basically they will use cilia to sweep food into the oral groove. And the food will form a food molecule inside the cell, and an enzyme will start to digest the food, and the nutrients are therefore absorbed. An amoeba, which is another example of animal-like protist, they ingest or they engulf food with pseudopodia, and I'm going to mention that later in the episode. Now let me show you guys a clip showing how paramecium eat food and release the waste into the environment. But now let's move on to plant-like protists. They are autotrophs that are capable of making their own food, and they contain chloroplasts that enable them to carry out photosynthesis as plants do. Well, you don't have to know the diagram or like the name of each organelle in their cell, either the functions. And well, let's move on to fungus-like protists. Fungus-like protists are heterotrophs that feed mostly on decaying organic matter, as fungi do, and they are like the decomposer protists. I'm gonna show you guys a table that includes basically everything we've talked about so far. And there we go, this is a table, and as you can see, there are three types of protists. And the following are the examples of each type of protist and main features of the protist. Now let's figure out how the protists move. So basically, protists can move in 4 different ways. And let's start with the first one, which is pseudopodia, aka false feet. This type of movement is mainly used by the protist amoeba. And in order to give you guys a better idea of how they move, let me show you a clip. Apart from pseudopodia, some protists are able to move with the structure called cilia. So cilia is a hair-like structure covering the surface of the cell. So there are hundreds of cilia in one cell. And the protists that move with cilia are called ciliates. And this way of movement is faster compared to pseudopodia. And again, I'm going to play a clip right now. Protists are also able to move with flagella. And this type of movement is used by Euglena, which is a plant-like protist. I listed here, as you can see, and Trypanosoma, which is an animal-like protist, but unfortunately I didn't list it here. Again, you don't have to memorize the names. And also, just to let you guys know that some protists can have one flagellum, for example, Euglena, while others can have multiple flagella. And again, I'm going to play a clip right now. Well, these type of movement should not be counted as a type of movement technically, because for the protists that move passively, they lack movement structures and they rely on water current holes to move around the environment. And the protists that move passively include Plasmodium, which is an animal-like protist, and Diatom, which is a plant-like protist. And again, I listed the terms in the table right over here. And for this one, I'm not going to show you guys a clip because you guys can actually imagine how they move in the water by floating or gliding. What about protist interactions in ecosystem? Well, a plant-like protist algae can perform 50% to 70% of all photosynthesis on Earth, so they produce most of the world's oxygen. Well, a lot of people believe that trees contribute most of the world's oxygen, but they're incorrect. It is algae. Climate change can affect protists. Warmer and more acidic environment can interfere with protists' ability to make protective shells, and without them, protists cannot survive. They would just simply die. Furthermore, if there are too many algae growing on a pond, they will block the sunlight from entering the pond. As a result, the organism living in the river or living under the water will get killed due to lack of oxygen. In grade 11 biology, the protist reproduction is rarely tested, and all you have to know is that protists can reproduce either sexually or asexually. And some common ways of asexual reproduction include binary fission, budding, and fragmentation. And the only way of sexual reproduction is called conjugation. And I'm not going to read through this slide. You guys just can read it yourself. On the test paper, if you're given the description or the definition of a way of reproduction, you should be able to match the description with the correct name. The last thing I want to talk about in today's lesson is something called endosymbiotic theory, and a majority of scientists do believe in the theory. So basically, around 3.5 billion years ago, the first life forms were simple prokaryotic cells, which were bacteria and archaea. And around 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, a type of prokaryote engulfed an aerobic bacterium, which was likely an ancestor of the modern mitochondria. And instead of digesting it, the whole cell in the bacterium formed a symbiotic relationships. And what they did was basically the bacterium or the mitochondria produced ATP energy through aerobic respiration. And over time, the bacterium evolved into mitochondria. And later, some of these early eukaryotic cells engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium, and this eventually became chloroplast, allowing these cells to perform photosynthesis. With mitochondria, and in some cases, chloroplast, these cells gradually became more complex, leading to the evolution of modern eukaryotic cells, which are plants, animals, and fungi. And just keep in mind that protists are the oldest eukaryotic organisms. Lastly, I've got some thinking questions for you. And again, they're pretty simple. And that's the end of the presentation, and I'll see you in the next episode.